We are delighted as the Balsillie School of International Affairs to act in a very agile, nimble way to bring in one of Canada's leading experts on Venezuela, Ben Rowswell, to give us an exclusive online briefing on the crisis entitled Sovereignty Under Strain. My name's Anne Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and I'm delighted to open this event and then pass it to my colleague, Professor Alistair Edgar, afterwards to moderate. I'm going to introduce Ben. He is a consultant with Catalyze 4, a strategic advisory service that helps companies with Canada's new nation building strategy. He served as Canada's most recent ambassador to Venezuela from 2014 to 2017. This capped a 25-year career in Canadian diplomacy, which also included assignments such as representative of Canada in Kandahar, Afghanistan. And he was deputy ambassador to Afghanistan in this capacity. Chargé of Affairs, Chargé d'Affaires to Iraq, as well as some other assignments for Canada's embassies in Washington and Cairo, and at our permanent mission to the UN. So he's incredibly well placed to discuss the issues today. Throughout his career, his principal thematic focus was on democracy and human rights. He launched a democracy policy until within headquarters in 2006, as well as the Protection of Democracy Fund. And he's led innovation into the use of social media to advance human rights in Iran and other authoritarian countries, an approach known as direct diplomacy. While on leave from the government, he worked with an NGO known as the National Democratic Institute in Baghdad, and with a think tank known as the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. And he launched a software startup to crowdsource civic action called Better Place. From 2018 to 2023, he served as president of the Canadian International Council, an organization that the Balsillie School has collaborated with on a number of occasions. Ben, it is wonderful to have you today. Thank you for dropping everything to be available to brief our community. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's a pleasure to speak to the Balsillie School again. I think I spoke a few years ago there in person, and we have a very active Canadian International Council branch in Waterloo that I've spoken at a few times. So it's lovely to reconnect with students at Balsillie and the community there, and more broadly with Canadians that are worried about what's happening in Venezuela, worried about what's happening with the United States and our role in the world. And so welcome to all of you. In my remarks today, I'm going to provide a sense of what Venezuela was like before January 3rd, what changes on January 3rd. I'll then go through various ways of thinking about Canada's interests and conclude with how we weigh these various different interests, so that we can get a sense of what the priorities should be. This is a moment, I think, in international relations more generally, certainly in the region and certainly in Canada, where everything seems to be completely up in the air. And I think it's important for us to take a global view of Canada's interests, even as we're focusing on a specific regional issue, because this country does not exist in a vacuum. And if ever there was a crisis in one specific country that I think carries fundamental implications for all of us in the region, this is this crisis in Venezuela. Toyed with a bunch of different titles, though the one I had also thought about was that Venezuela might be the place where the rules-based international order died. Let me come back to why I think that might be an interesting way to think about about what's happening right now in Venezuela and the imperative for Canadian action. In context, there's always a debate about how far back you go in history and what date kind of signifies what story you want to tell about the country of Venezuela. If there are any Venezuelans online, I do invite them to speak. There's a dramatic dearth of Venezuelan voices in Canadian media. I wish I wasn't always the one being asked to talk about Venezuela, but I invite those of you that live this crisis most directly to speak up. The story that I think I would like to relate is about Venezuela's impact in the broader world, and that I'll start with January 2015. January 15 was when the instability that had been building up in Venezuela for years, if not decades, suddenly burst beyond the boundaries of Venezuela and became a significant source of instability for all of the Americas. Why January 15th? Well, Venezuela under successive governments, but even more dramatically under the Chavista governments in place since 1999, have made oil, have allowed oil to become not just the main, but really the exclusive source of revenue for the country. By the time that I was there, from 2014 to 2017, it was the source of 96% of foreign revenues. So essentially, it's a one product economy. That means it's extraordinarily vulnerable to changes in international price of oil, which of course fluctuates dramatically. And one reason why the Venezuela has had such a rough ride over the past few years is that the international price of oil has gone like this. In December 14th, it dropped from over $100 a barrel to $9 a barrel. And that was like a nuclear bomb going off on the Venezuelan economy for various reasons. I won't go back previous to 2015 unless people want to ask me about the earlier chapters in the Q&A. By 2015, the government that was in place had essentially no capacity or no ability or no willingness to make changes to their economic policy to manage, to respond to this nuclear bomb that had just gone off. And so Venezuelans began to pour out of the country, fleeing the human misery that this economic devastation had caused and the hopelessness over any sense that they might be able to select a government that could respond to the crisis. 8 million people left in relatively short order, creating the largest wave of human migration in this hemisphere's known history. And we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years. We've never seen a flow of migrants out of Venezuela. And that has placed enormous pressure on the region and on the world in a time when the norms of the international system were already significantly under threat. How do we respond as a region to that kind of outpouring? There had already been many regional norms that had been broken through Venezuela's growing instability over the years, such as a general prohibition on the use of on having political prisoners, which had become quite rare in Latin America from the 80s on, has now become quite common in Venezuela. Widespread abuses of torture in prisons, the use of food as a weapon, as a political weapon. All of those regional norms had already kind of gone by the wayside. But when 8 million people start spreading through the entire hemisphere, you've got global norms at stake. And one that I would argue has largely been completely destroyed in the last year or two is the treatment afforded refugees in the international system, where it was originally just a few really quite far right governments that just violated their obligation to welcome refugees into the country under the 1951 Geneva Convention. The United States itself undertook that, and very much in response to this massive wave of Venezuelans. And that domino now seems to be falling around the world, that countries are going down to zero, accepting zero refugees, zero refugees, zero refugees. And so this is one way that instability in Venezuela has sent shrapnel essentially entirely through the international system, obviously adding on the Syrian and the Afghan and many other refugee outflows. We're now seeing violations as the presence of Venezuelans in the United States became a focus of political rhetoric by the far right in that country, and encouraging increasingly cruel treatment of undocumented people in the United States. The U.S. actively looked for ways to show the use of force, to take control of migration issues and of drug issues. and searched for a number of places where they could use U.S. military force against the various flows associated with the nexus of undocumented aliens and crime, the sort of centerpiece of that far right ideology in the United States. Initially considered bombing fentanyl factories in Mexico, and was the Trump administration was sort of steered away for that for various reasons, and decided that the easier target would be civilian boats off the coast of Venezuela. The United States quickly murdered more than 100 people, civilians. There's no sign whatsoever that they had any military markings on this boats. And so we also now have the norm of the protection of civilians on the high seas, the protections of civilians in conflict, which is in the process of being shattered. Inside the country, there has been the same regime has been in power since 1999. It's now into its third leader, but it's still sticking with the pre-January 3rd era. Say January 2nd, it was still Nicolas Maduro, who had been the loyal vice president to Hugo Chavez with none of his charisma, but who, since Chavez's death in 2013, had managed to consolidate power within the regime and operate really quite a collective system of governance. It was not a cult of his personality. It was he was very adept at managing various factions in an undemocratic government. That government's popularity has been tested on multiple occasions, and ever since, well, the last free and fair election that I think meets most international standards without too much challenge is January 2015. So that same month that I started our sort of little potted Venezuelan history, when the Legislative Assembly held elections that were won in an absolutely overwhelming landslide by a coalition of various political parties across the political spectrum, but that collectively are called the opposition, la oposición. Essentially, the Chavista regime decided at that point never to have free and fair elections ever again. They were tested at the polls at many levels. I'll just refer to the presidential ones. In 2018, massive fraud. Canada called it out. Essentially, all the serious players of the Americas called it out. So from 2018 forward, it's quite clear that there is absolutely no public support for the government, and there's this gap between the authorities running the country and the people being governed that is absolutely explosive. Fast forward to 2024, same situation once again. Maduro goes back to the polls, is absolutely lambasted at the polls. There's a massive outpouring of support for the opposition candidate, who was Edmundo Gonzalez. We have proof of that because of an ingenious system that the opposition used to document what happened at each and every polling station across the country, and it was about 2/3 in favor. So really an absolute earthquake of a landslide, largely on the backs of the popularity of Maria Corina Machado, who had identified Gonzalez as the preferred candidate. So you've got the political situation, in other words, is that you've got a deeply, deeply despised government from across the spectrum, left, right, center, urban, rural, every single pocket of Venezuela really, really detests the regime. And that requires the regime to engage in ever more serious forms of repression. After 2024, they name the most notorious thug in the entire regime, who's Diosdado Cabello, to take over. And he institutes a reign of terror in 2024, with particular emphasis on the working class barrios, the slums and the high places all around Venezuela, which had previously been the stronghold of the Chavista regime. Given that they had then turned against the Chavista regime, they became target number one. And so there's an incredibly violent purge of anyone who speaks out publicly and politically across Venezuela, and especially in those areas that had previously been the Chavez stronghold. And so, in short, political situation is just completely at a dead end, where Venezuelans feel no ability to affect any change in their society at all, in spite of the economic ruin that they were facing. So in comes 150 aircraft from the U.S. Armed Forces on January 3rd and performs an absolutely stunning feat of military prowess to decapitate a government, to take a single person out of the capital and to remove him from the political situation. There's no denying that it was a military feat of incredible daring and seemingly flawless execution. It doesn't change a single thing politically in the country. As I said, this is not a government that was oriented around the person of the president. Like if this had happened against Hugo Chavez, maybe that would have been similar, but that'll be for historians to noodle out. With the removal of Maduro, it really doesn't change anything because there's a number of figures that really have almost equal control to him, and there's a constant management of the engagement between them. Not really like a cabinet process, but just to think in like purely political science terms, this is a collectively run government. So you just remove one individual, and the rest of the collective just carries on. The vice president, again, a very loyal vice president to the president, takes over and declares his departure to be a travesty and commits to exactly the same political agenda that this regime has been delivering for 26 years. Her name is Delcy Rodriguez. Just quick sort of personality take on her. She is the most passionate, committed communist you'll ever meet. I don't tend to use the term communist lightly. Is this too dark for me to speaking? Because I'm getting tired of there's like a motion detector here somewhere. But anyway, if
It's
you can see me and hear me,
it's fine, Ben. Yeah.
it's actually quite reminiscent of Venezuela. Like it's not actually a blackout in this building, but that gives you a little hint of what it must be like to live in Venezuela. Delcy Rodriguez is I don't use the word communist very lightly because it's usually used in a pejorative sense and not by people who self-identify. But if anyone would self-identify, it would be her. The historical figure that comes to mind is in the Spanish communist movement of the 1930s. There was an extremely eloquent and passionate woman that they called La Pasionara, and Delcy is often referred to as La Pasionara of Venezuela. So about the most ideologically fervent committed, like her entire being essentially is about the communist movement and the great socialist revolution. So there's no political change discernible in Venezuela right now. The major change, which I'll come to briefly, is that this hated government, is now propped up by the United States. And that, I think, is going to have a significant impact on events going forward. But let's go back to the instability, which is the way I think we need to understand the story of Venezuela, is that it's a country that has suffered from terrible instability and exports terrible instability and is not in any sense stable. I mean, there's a lot of authoritarian regimes in the world, but they can be classified as stable authoritarian and unstable authoritarian. This is unstable authoritarianism. And why? Mostly because of the economic devastation that continues to this day. Just to take a snapshot of the economic situation right now, the situation facing individual people, if you take a basket of food items that would be what an average human being just needs to survive in a day-to-day context, regardless of where you are in the socioeconomic strata. And then you take what the average wage is relative to the basket of food. So it's like a proxy for survival. And the answer is that the average wage covers 27% of food requirements, meaning the average Venezuelan only receives a quarter of the food that they need to survive. I haven't been there in many years, I should point out, but I did have some experience of this when I was in Venezuela. I noticed my employees getting thinner and thinner. And it was estimated that in the year of 2017 alone, that was my last year there, that the average weight loss of the average human being in Venezuela was 19 kilograms. Just imagine like looking around at your fellow human beings and all of a sudden they're 20 pounds lighter. Maybe losing 2 or 3 pounds might be okay. Some people might like that, but 19 pounds is like a health crisis on steroids. And they are still in that position of economic hardship. The minimum wage, we would essentially have to earn 167 times the minimum wage in order to afford that same basket. So there are also like no economic policies in place that are having any impact. As a result, a country that was traditionally the richest in all of Latin America now has 80% of people below the poverty rate and 50% below the extreme poverty rate. What does that mean in terms of everyday people's lives? Again, one of the wealthiest and highest levels of development of any country in the Americas now ranks in infant mortality as the fourth lowest in all of the Americas. So the only ones that are worse off are Bolivia, Haiti, and Guyana. And in terms of maternal mortality, it's the third worst. So there is human suffering on a really colossal scale in Venezuela. What will change as a result of January 3rd? Well, as I mentioned, there's no change of government. There's no change of regime whatsoever. Let's divide this up politically and economically and start with economics, since I think that's what really matters most to the people on the ground in Venezuela. There's only one source of revenue for the whole country, and that is oil. Oh, my lights are back on. So the control over oil obviously is of extreme political importance in Venezuela. And the Maduro regime was essentially organized. I'll say the Rodriguez regime now, because it probably will be that for some time to come. The Rodriguez regime is organized around how that money is processed and how the revenues are divided. There's a form of institutionalized corruption where the revenues are then sold for bolivars, which because of hyperinflation operate at a completely different exchange rate in the Venezuelan economy. And if you force people to buy your goods in this nominally meaningless currency, you create a massive gap between what you just purchased and what it's really worth. And that is a source of tremendous patronage. They allocate that right very strategically. Who gets to buy gas at basically close to zero and then sell it at the market rate? And essentially, it's the generals and all the heads of the intelligence agencies that now have that economic power. And that's what makes them buy into the system, because they can make the time that I was there, I think they were making $150. They would buy at the equivalent of $1 and they would sell it for $150. It's like a money-making machine. And that's essentially how the regime has stayed together through the use of oil well. So now introduce another set of actors that are going to tap into that oil wealth. Now, the United States has said it won't actually require that it's going to just grab the oil. It's not going to exchange it for bolivars or require people to buy it in bolivars, but they're going to sell it on the international market itself. But the US has made it very clear they will decide how the money is allocated. Anyway, the production is going to be fixed for some time. It'll take a long time for the infrastructure to be improved. So you're taking the same flow that was not enough even for Venezuelans to get a quarter of what they needed to put to remain alive, like their food basket, and it's going to be further subdivided because the current regime is in place. They still have to pay off all the generals and the intelligence heads, but they also have to pay off Donald Trump. So you're seeing a significant reduction in the economic assets available to deal with social and economic conditions that are in massive crisis. Politically, what does it mean? Well, the first few days on the ground have been terrifying ones for the people of Venezuela. There certainly was a moment of jubilation when Maduro was gone, because he, leader of this hated regime. Within the sort of 24 hours that it took to realize that Delcy Rodriguez was in power, there was a panic across the country, and schools were closed. There was massive rush on all the grocery stores. People holed up in their apartments waiting for the wave of repression to follow, specifically in the form of these ununiformed thugs, sort of like ICE agents, but like the Venezuelan version. They walk around with these massive these massive semi-automatic weapons, usually on motorcycles, so they can move quickly in the traffic, and therefore they're called sometimes called motorizados, which is the name of a motorbike. Sometimes colectivos, as they were meant to be an arm of the socialist revolution, the sort of collective will of the people as expressed through everyday, Joe on the street, kind of taking matters into his own hands. That was the sort of socialist conception of the role of colectivos, but they've become just like brown shirts in the Nazi era, or I guess that was the Italian fascists who had brown shirts. Anyway, it's often authoritarian regimes, or the Basij in Iran. There's often like a heavily armed, ununiformed paramilitary force that does the actual, like keeps the population in check. If anyone waves, it mentions that they're happy that Maduro's gone, the colectivos take a knock at the door. So that's really what's happening now on the ground. You're seeing this spike in repression and therefore fear among the population. The big change, of course, is that the United States is now part of the regime or complicit with the regime. I'm not sure if we really found the right way to describe it when you take a failed state and instead of having an outside force, instead of regime change, which would be to get rid of them and then occupy the country and set up some kind of temporary governing authority, they actually just merge with the repressive regime for the stated purpose of securing natural resources. I suppose colonialism would be another way of describing it. Anyway, I'll turn to you, the political scientists, for some suggestions about how to describe this, because it's not the first time in history that you've had that degree of collusion between an imperial authority and a deeply corrupt, hated local administration. What it does mean is that Venezuelans who thought that there might be some kind of political change and who had hoped, over the many, many years of peaceful political protests or trying to organize, had turned to the United States as, maybe some kind of outside military intervention would bring change, are now realizing the military intervention has happened and the United States has gotten into bed with Delcy Rodriguez, and the kind of despair that brings, given that their economic hardships that they're living in, this sort of sense of despair that there is no future, cannot but increase the outflow of migrants from Venezuela. They've already been voting with their feet to the tune of 8 million, and we should probably expect several more going now. So let me move quickly to Canada. I realize I'm taking a lot of time here. I get passionate when I talk about Venezuela, as you can tell. How do we think about Canada's interests? So generally, when you're talking about foreign policy, you look at our economic interests, our security interests, and perhaps our norms or our values. Those might be sort of three baskets that we are used to thinking. Those all presume that there's a decision to be made by Canada, and therefore there's kind of I don't know if it's the overarching or maybe it's like the foundational consideration, which precedes whether we're going to pursue values or whether we're going to pursue interests, whether we're going to advance our economic objectives, and that is that we are able to make decisions. The term is sovereignty, and to the extent that our sovereignty is taken for granted, it's understood widely that we can take decisions. Then we can have our debates about values versus interests. In this case, obviously, the sovereignty of Venezuela has been very clearly discarded, but the state party discarding the sovereignty or disregarding the sovereignty of another country has declared in an official policy and made explicit through threat after threat after threat that it is the principle of state sovereignty in the Americas that it no longer recognizes. That is, the United States does not recognize that any of the other 33 countries in the Americas is fully sovereign. It has arrogated to itself a category of decisions that can only be made in Washington, and the decisions of any other country would only be with this. It cannot disagree with what Washington is setting, and so it has put us on notice that when there are decisions in that category, we no longer have the right to make those decisions. Now, in the Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, Monroe, obviously the 1823 president who said that more or less Latin America is the Americas are our domain. The Trump corollary says, specifically when it comes to the control of natural resources or strategic resources, I think is the word in the NSS, that the United States decides who gets to control what and who gets to exploit which strategic resources in all of the Americas. And if there's any doubt that that meant Canada, why would they be reaching past Canada for Greenland? It very much does include Canada. So there is a full direct threat to Canada's sovereignty on a level that we haven't seen in so long that no one in the current foreign policy establishment has any experience in responding to that. And as a result, I think you're seeing a tremendous degree of confusion and far more silence than we would expect out of our foreign policy establishment because we just have never been here. We just have never had our country's sovereignty directly questioned and directly threatened with the kinds of actions that the Trump administration has taken. And as a result, I think you're seeing a really weak and uncertain response to Venezuela that in and of itself is a significant threat to Canada. If we don't find a more forceful way to respond, then we really will be doing a disservice to Canadians by allowing a reduction in our sovereignty to stand. What are the ways that you could look at making pushing back against that assault on the sovereignty of the Americas? One of them is declaratory policy. Canada is very, very adept at declaratory policy, and in some sense, we're actually uniquely suited for it. We have relatively few pressures on us to prevent us from saying things, and as a result, we tend to say more things than other countries. We say the things that are difficult for other countries to say. It's not all just virtue signaling. There's a role for public statements to reinforce or weaken rules in a rules-based international order, and that's why declaratory policy is actually an extremely important instrument. It's one that we've relied on perhaps too much, but it is actually an effective way to stand up for norms. And so we could potentially be saying to the United States that their military action in Venezuela is an assault on the sovereignty of a fellow state, and that we don't accept it. We certainly don't accept the implications of the Trump corollary on the Monroe Doctrine. We have not done so, but that is an option. The other option, I think, that's presented by our history in Venezuela, and I think is really quite an exciting opportunity for us, is that we have traditionally been, if not one of the leading international actors focused and helping on the issue of democracy and human rights in Venezuela. And when I was there, we were a very active embassy helping human rights activists, sometimes sheltering them when necessary. We were the go-to embassy if you were a democracy or human rights activist and you needed help, because we had greater protection from the repercussions of an angry Venezuelan government. And we weren't the United States, which is a whole different ball of wax. It was under this guise, and consistent with decades of history of Canada's involvement in the Americas, where we've been a leading actor on democracy and human rights, that Peru turned to us in 2017 through their ambassador Mario Lopez Chavarri at the time, pulling me aside at an embassy event saying, "You helped us so much in our country's transition from authoritarianism to democracy in 2000. Why don't our two countries step forward and do that again with the democratic transition that has to happen here in Venezuela?" I was gone by the time the decision was actually made, but it became the Lima group. We were initially thinking it would be like a Friends of Venezuela group, sort of Security Council. Often has like these friends groups, but Security Council is not really active in this case. So the democracies of the region gathered in this group called the Lima Group, and coordinated global efforts or regional efforts to create the conditions necessary for democratic transition following the lead of Venezuelans. This is really quite unique. I don't think I have time to get into it today, but read my Globe and Mail article tomorrow that will describe this unique approach to democracy promotion that respects the sovereignty of the state in question of Venezuela. It failed for a number of reasons. The Lima Group has sort of fallen into abeyance. But Canada could very easily just put up its hands and say, we want the various democracies of the region to come together to a meeting in Ottawa, and we're going to coordinate what each of us is saying about what's happening in Venezuela, how each of us is voting in the OAS, how each of us is voting in the UN. And through that, we're going to create enough momentum that the peoples of the Americas can be said to be standing up for the sovereignty of one of their states. And in that sense, not necessarily attack the Trump administration head on through words, but actually use actions, and actions that Venezuelans and Latin Americans are already expecting us to take, which is that we will bring together the voices of democracy in the region, and we will, by promoting a democratic transition, we will, by extension, be working to restore and asserting the importance of restoring the sovereignty of Venezuela. So those are the two options for defending sovereignty, the absolute must-do of Canadian foreign policy. We absolutely must fight for our sovereignty. We can either do that through words in some kind of declaration against the Trump administration, or we can do that through action by taking on our historic role in Venezuela. I don't see us doing either of those yet. I certainly hope the government is thinking about option B, which would be my preferred one. But the absolute worst, the dereliction of duty would be for us to either say nothing about Venezuela and do nothing. That essentially would be surrendering to an attack on the sovereignty of states in the Americas.